This is Beyond the Limits. I'm Mike.
And I'm Matt, and today we're diving into the molecule that perhaps gets more bad press than any other, and that is cholesterol.
So, the headlines remain the same. High cholesterol is dangerous. Reduce your bad cholesterol. But as we will explain, there's a little bit more nuance to this question. We now know that your risk isn't just about the total quantity of cholesterol in your blood, but about what that cholesterol is packaged into, where it's going, and the steps you take to address it.
Yeah, and today we're going to muse on a more foundational question, and that is everything we think we know about cholesterol actually wrong? Should you be checking your cholesterol regardless of your age or your general health? We'll be explaining the crucial difference between the molecule and its microscopic transport system, and discuss whether or not we should all be more proactive in our management of cholesterol. Now, Mike, welcome. I'm aware that you have had your cholesterol checked recently. Congratulations. How was that?
Yeah, it was a very pleasant experience, the actual blood test, until I got the results, and then it all went a little bit downhill from there. I'm blaming my strong Scottish heritage and not the amount of cheese I eat or my general health or exercise at the moment.
Why does being Scottish give you a high cholesterol?
I think it's a genetic thing. Anyway, I'm really glad we're talking about cholesterol. I know I've been twisting your arm to do this for a while. But as you know, and as I've told you over and over again, I had this kind of eureka moment fairly recently where, slightly concerningly, I don't think I'd entirely understood cholesterol from medical school. And the basics, yes, in terms of managing it, but actually the fundamentals of this, I think, are really interesting.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'd agree with some of the fundamental principles and maybe my misunderstanding as well. And I'm looking forward to laying that bare today. So I think, look, we've picked maybe what's an incredibly unsexy, unexciting topic, I hear you say, but this is incredibly important, isn't it? I think if you asked most people how to lower your cholesterol, they'd give you the wrong answer. And I think actually if you ask most doctors, how do you lower your cholesterol? Again, I think that answer would shock you. The misunderstanding around cholesterol is huge. The understanding of dietary approach to lower cholesterol, I think, is also poor. And I think there are certain myths and conspiracy theories around statins and the likes that is also widespread. Now, there are new advances, there's new drugs, there's new guidance. So if you are focused in on how ashwagandha may reduce your stress levels or how magnesium may lower your blood pressures, I ask you to stop scrolling, laser your attention into the next 20 minutes or so of this episode, as the information here will likely affect your dietary decisions and I think is going to help you make more informed decisions regarding medications, and it's going to help you live longer and healthier. I guarantee it.
That's the issue, Matt, isn't it? Deaths from cardiovascular incidents, so strokes or heart attacks, which we know are massively related to a high cholesterol, they're still super high, not just in the UK, but worldwide.
It's not just super high. Globally, this is the highest cause of mortality, cardiovascular disease. So heart attack and stroke being those primary drivers. But I'm not saying it's the seventh or the sixth highest cause. It is the highest cause worldwide. In the UK, it's no longer the highest cause. That's being taken over by dementia and Alzheimer's disease now. But it remains the top cause of death for men. This is big stuff. This is a meaty topic. And I think we need to consider cholesterol as the kind of clogging of our plumbing. You pour too much fat down the sink, you get this furring of the arteries. I think that visceral understanding is helpful here because I think it's really important to understand cholesterol as being causative to those problems. And we'll touch on this a little bit later, but there's also this insidious nature of high cholesterol. I'm gonna beat you to it and bring out the first analogy, but I think we talk about cardiovascular risk and death, and I like to think of that as, say, the motorways of your blood vessels. So these really big arteries that supply the oxygen to your heart or the oxygen to your brain. If one of those clogs, you have either a heart attack or a stroke, respectively. But there is also this insidious nature that I talked about of having high cholesterol that affects not just the motorways, but it's the B roads, it's the country roads. And if you're clogging up those, then yes, you don't have a big, significant life-changing event, but you can have this gradual progressive disease accumulating that's ultimately reducing your path, reducing your map. I don't know if you've ever been to the Devon roads or the Cornish roads where those hedgerows get really kind of, encroaching on the road, and it's a nightmare to get to. When you get there, it's beautiful, and I think I would hate to think that you can't visit those places.
Okay, so we're going with hedgerows and motorways. I have got a corker of analogy for you, and I know I've been teasing it to you all day, but but bear with me. It doesn't involve zombies, but I think it's useful.
What, you're just going to go straight into it after my beautiful analogy?
No,
You're
no,
just
no. I'm going to give it a build up. I'm going to give it a build up. Okay.
Yeah.
But actually, I'm going to take you back really basic and just do a really quick explainer. So, what is cholesterol? Fundamentally, this is a waxy material that is really important actually in our bodies. It acts as this building block for membranes of every cell in our body, pretty much. And it's utilized to manufacture vitamin D, your bile acids, and all your steroid hormones. So, really important thing. It's not just this sticky fat-like substance that raises your risk of having a heart attack. Now, people will be familiar with the terms good and bad cholesterol. You certainly see it on the side of whatever types of butter, that this is your good cholesterol and not your bad cholesterol. And that's what we're told, right? We've got to keep our bad cholesterol low. We've got to get our good cholesterol high. So the semantics here is that cholesterol is all the same. So a cholesterol molecule, every single cholesterol molecule in the body looks exactly the same. That's not the issue. We're going to talk a little bit about lipoproteins, and this leads me on to my analogy. So if you've got anything you want to say beforehand, get it out of there now, because this is going to go on.
Go for it now. I'm strapped in.
Okay, bear with me. So I want you to imagine that your body is a city, okay, but it's interlinked not by roads, but by canals. Venice, if you will, or Birmingham. So cholesterol, as we've said, it's essential for building cells and making hormones. Now, it's fat soluble and as such can't swim in these canals, so it needs to be transported from the liver, that's the factory, to the rest of the body, the building sites, if you will. So this is where lipoproteins come in. So low density lipoproteins, that's your LDL, is like a large, ungainly, poorly maintained cruise ship. It's slow, it's prone to drifting off course and running adrift. And when this cruise ship gets stuck, the cholesterol passengers get dumped onto the walls and they cause traffic jams, build up, and ultimately hard plaques. So it's not the passenger or the cholesterol that is bad, but the sheer number of cruise ships that are getting stuck. So high density lipoprotein, so this is HDL, in contrast, is like a small, highly maneuverable jet ski zipping around the canals, picking up stranded or excess passengers and ferrying them back to the liver for recycling or disposal. The medical term for that is reverse cholesterol transport. So this is why high levels of HDL and low levels of LDL is a good thing. And that, Matthew, is my cruise ship analogy.
Okay, yeah, I like it. I think it was good. It was much more comprehensive than mine. The only criticism that I'd mention is that you were talking about cruise ships in Venice, and I just think that's
sort of rather on the nose,
unrealistic, but otherwise good. Okay, shall I move us on and talk about statins then? So you must have had your head in the sand if you've not heard of statins. I think most people have. Statins is one class of medications that we prescribe to lower people's cholesterol levels. When I say cholesterol levels, we're targeting the LDL specifically here because that's the nuisance. And there are low intensity and there are high intensity versions of statins, aren't they? But they work by inhibiting a liver enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase, and ultimately, this leads to less cholesterol production in the liver and actually more reabsorption of cholesterol from the blood and excretion of this by the liver. Now, there are other medications as well, ezetimibe, bempedoic acid, this new one called inclisiran, which is an injectable form, and there are combinations of these as well. Some people are just have really resistantly high levels of cholesterol that need combinations of these medications. But that's a brief summary of what the medications are. We're going to get a bit philosophical now, though, because we're going to talk about something called the Q-risk score, which might put some of our doctor friends to sleep, but I think there's actually some interesting points in here. To talk about that more, I think we need to explain what the Q-risk score is. So the Q-risk score is a formula, isn't it? And it has various things that go into it. I think we're on our third edition of this now, so Q-risk has reached Q-risk 3, which is the most comprehensive and most up-to-date version of this formula. What it does is it considers lots of independent risk factors, so namely your sex, your age, whether you smoke, whether you suffer with migraines, whether you have chronic kidney disease, and it put all of these various independent risk factors into a formula and it spits out this risk statistic, and it gives you it as a percentage, and it's looking at the next 10 years ahead, and it's basically saying, here is what we think is your risk of having a major cardiovascular event over the next 10 years. Now, we have a slightly arbitrary cutoff point of being 10%. So if you walk into a GP surgery and have your bloods done, your cholesterol levels come back and they say, right, well, because you are 55, you're male, your cholesterol level's this, you're a smoker, blah, 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 your risk is now 25%. And actually that's above our arbitrary 10% cutoff. And that's where doctors will say, right, here's some medication. This is too high. We need to do something about this. But if you look at this graph over time, so from birth till death, or from birth till when you're 100, this graph just slowly goes up. And the reason being is that some of those independent risk factors you just can't change. And the most important one is age. And your risk of a major cardiovascular event just goes up with time. It gets more likely the older you get. Now, coming back to that kind of arbitrary cutoff point of 10%, we had to draw a line in the sand where everything in medicine, there's a risk and a benefit, isn't there? And we have to talk about your relative cardiovascular risk versus the absolute benefit of taking some medication to do something about it. And I think we have to decide on a certain cutoff point, don't we? But I guess the question I'll pose back to you, Mike, is what are your thoughts on this slightly arbitrary level? And what do you think the implications are prior to this?
Yeah, and I think that's always been the counter argument to this. And I think the arguments against Q risk, which I think are very fair, and I to some degree agree with, are that Q risk is fine. I put my scores in today. I put my age, I put the fact I have migraines, the fact I'm a non-smoker, and my blood pressure, which we won't mention, and my cholesterol levels, and that came out with a risk of 2.2%. Now, that's fine. That's low. That, as per the guidelines that you mentioned, I'm not going to be recommended statins, but it's all very well if you only plan to live for the next 10 years. There are arguments for saying, actually, could we be doing this better, or could we be approaching this in a slightly different way? Most compelling argument for me with regards to that is this theory, and I don't want to labour the point. I've used up my analogy card for the night, but is this cumulative damage? So long before you're going to hit that 10% reading on the Q risk score, you're going to be causing that damage to those vessels. You're going to be laying down that grease in your pipes, as you mentioned at the start. And so it feels slightly strange to be thinking, well, we know this is happening. We know that your levels are high, for instance, and we're just going to allow this to happen and happen and happen until you hit that 10%, and then you can do something about it. And I think that's my slight concern with this. Now, the other approach to doing this is to look at your lifetime risks. So there are various calculators out there. They ask fairly similar questions, but actually the idea there is to give more of a longer term view of things. So actually to look at your risk over the next 25 years or 30 years or even longer than that. I think there's a really good argument for that, because actually all of us want to remain healthy for as long as we possibly can. It just feels like we could be more proactive. Now, if I put my scores into this lifetime risk, and that is by the age of 75, it's the way it works it out, it says that I've got a 17.7% risk of a heart attack or stroke by that age, which is a lot more scary, I guess, hearing that it's 1 in 5 pretty much. But actually what it then provides is a estimate of, actually, if you do something about this, if you can reduce your cholesterol, whether that's lifestyle or medication or whatever, this is what it can be. So it potentially provides a better view of your risk over a longer period of time.
Yeah, and I think that's useful, isn't it? That might help give patients or allow doctors to explain to patients a more tangible statistic that they might consider when they're younger. Because when we're younger, we all feel like we're invincible, don't we? But living a healthy lifestyle, can start earlier, can't we? And that can be evidence to back that up. Moving us on though, Mike, because I'm aware that there are some new developments or some new ground that we need to cover in cholesterol management, and this is where it gets a bit juicy, because there's more tests and there's a greater understanding that we can garner, isn't there?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because I had not even heard of it. I'll be completely honest, I'd not even heard of this a few months ago. And if you were to ask your GP or actually any doctor that you know whether they have, I think a lot of people would be in a similar boat. And this is something called lipoprotein little a. This is a very specific type of lipoprotein. So it starts as this regular LDL particle. So this going back to my analogy, is this cruise ship. It's then got what we call an ApoB, so an apolipoprotein B kind of attachment to it. Then it's also got this extra unique protein attached to it called apolipoprotein A. That is a really long and overly complicated way of saying that if you have this lipoprotein little a, it's not great. It's actually quite bad news. So it's a little bit like one of those cruise ships having a variety of harpoons sticking out of it that can cause that damage to the vessel walls, can stick to it, can cause that build up even more effectively. The other analogy is like Velcro. It sort of sticks to the vessels and causes problems. Now, as I said, it's not kind of widely used. I mean, I know it is occasionally used in lipid clinics.
We should just say that it's a blood test as well, isn't it? You can determine this on a blood test.
Yeah, it's absolutely just it's a simple blood test. Now, it's felt if you've got that, you've got about anywhere between a 1.2 and a 3 times higher risk of having a major adverse cardiovascular event. Now, I think the problem is that lipoprotein little a levels, they're largely determined by your genetics, so around up to 90% determined by your genetics, and they generally remain relatively stable throughout your life. You actually hit your adult levels from the age of about 5, believe it or not. It's quite common. So whilst most people have a kind of low to moderate level, about 20% of the global population will exceed the threshold that's generally considered to be high risk. If you know you have this lipoprotein little a, it really does increase your risk ultimately. And I think it slightly moves the goalposts in terms of thinking about how aggressive you need to be in managing your cholesterol levels and your lifestyle as much as anything else. So it's an interesting one. It's not, I was trying to look at kind of the reasons why it's not been adopted. And I think a lot of that is because, there's no real treatment for it. So why would we do it? There's also no kind of standardized worldwide agreement from various medical organizations that it's absolutely worthwhile. Interestingly, though, the European Society of Cardiology suggests that adults should have it tested at least once in their life. And I think that it adds something here. I think that the whole theme of this is that do we need to be a little bit more proactive about our management of this rather than just waiting till we get older where the damage has already been done. And actually, I think knowing your lipoprotein little a is potentially quite important here.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And it's just a one-off test, isn't it? This doesn't change over time. You know if you have this or you don't. And it, like you said, it comes in scales, doesn't it? You can have this in a severe form or a mild form, but that genetic risk doesn't change over time. It's interesting that this isn't part of our kind of traditional screening methods, and whether that might become more of a traditional screening method and whether or not it should be done at a younger age so that, like you said, people can have a higher awareness of an ongoing risk. I've just looked it up as well. It's not particularly expensive. It's ranging from about 50 to a kind of £160 just for this one-off test.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that unfortunately at the moment, if you ask your NHS GP for that, it's not something that's available on the NHS, for instance. Speaking very UK-centric here, but it is available privately, and obviously that incurs costs. The other point I didn't mention is that aortic valve stenosis, so a kind of stiffening of the aortic valve, that's known to be associated with lipoprotein little a. So we know that if you have high rates of that, you've got a higher risk of aortic stenosis and all of the issues that can come from that.
Got it. So the harpoons on the cruise ships target the aortic valve.
Indeed.
I guess we should then move on, shouldn't we, and talk about what actually can we do about cholesterol levels. What is the dietary approach rather than just these statins and these other medications? What can average Joe action today and utilise to make their cholesterol profile better?
Yeah, I'm interested to hear you outline these, Matt, because I've been eating my rabbit food over the last couple of days in response to getting my cholesterol checked yesterday. So actually, I'll be interested to hear whether I'm actually doing the right thing or whether I'm actually just making myself miserable for no good reason.
Yes, okay. So before I outline the dietary approach, I think it's worth noting that even if you tell your patient, so even if you say, okay, here is the dietary approach, this is what you need to do, even if you have the most motivated patient who then goes and lives like a nun and really follows your prescribed diet and lifestyle to the T, I think in the most optimistic of cases, you're gonna be able to reduce your LDL, so your low density lipoprotein, by about 30% at a maximum. The reason that's important or significant is that we know that these statin medications can be more powerful than that and can lower it by 40 to 50% within a number of weeks. That being said, all is not lost, and a good lifestyle is always important here. So just to briefly touch on this, because this may sound boring, so please don't turn off or tune out now, because this is actually really important and I think is misunderstood a lot of the time. And that is that a high-fat diet is not necessarily the problem. So the good fats, so these monosaturated fats like avocados and nuts, etc., they tend to spike the LDL levels a lot less than your saturated fats, so those in processed meats like bacon, lard, coconut oil. But the big misconception here is to simply avoid fat. You actually need fat in your diet. Like you said, cholesterol is in every single cell of the body. You need it to absorb vitamins, etc., etc. The key here is that high carbohydrate diets are actually a real cause of high cholesterol levels. Now, why is that? That's because that your liver creates cholesterol. It creates this LDL. So if you're eating refined sugars, if you're eating high carbohydrate diets, thinking that you're missing the bad stuff by not having the butter, but you're having the white bread, that is actually the problem, because your liver can produce these harmful container ships that transport your cholesterol. And we also talk about lifestyle as well, and it's not just your diet, but it's also what you drink and how you behave. So a key example here is that alcohol also has obviously very large quantities of sugar in it, and this can also cause this kind of LDL spikes that you need to try and avoid. I'm going to move us on now to another topic that we just wanted to cover quickly, and that is just maybe debunking some of these myths around statins, because there are lots, aren't there? So, Mike, I am going to pose to you a series of statements here, and I want to just get your take. I've put you on the spot here on each of these.
You're going to be embarrassing now when I can't, but go ahead.
So first up is that statins cause widespread muscle damage.
Is it true or false? False.
Okay, kind of false, yes.
Yeah, it's rare, very rare.
Yeah, so one of the common side effects is that statins cause something called myalgias, these muscle aches. And they, at the lower kind of 20 milligram dose of these high intensity statins, that can occur in about 5 to 10% of patients. So that's probably the most common side effect, is these muscle aches and pains. But muscle damage or severe muscle breakdown is something called rhabdomyolysis. This is extremely, extremely rare. This happens in about 1 in 10,000 patients who take this. Now, the next one is statins destroy your liver.
Again, I would say false. I think you can have a transient change in your liver enzymes. Is that right? After you take statins, but generally they're pretty safe.
Yeah, I think you've passed on that one. Yeah, they can cause this mild temporary rise in your liver enzymes, but serious liver damage is exceptionally rare. The last one that I'll pose to you is that once you start on statins, you can never stop.
Well, you can stop. Of course you can. You can if you want to, or if you don't tolerate them. I think generally most people who go on statins, that will end up being something they take forever, just because, as we've talked about, as you get older, your risk increases. I think I'm right in saying you can treat with statins for a short period of time, blitz things quite hard. And actually, I believe there's this kind of legacy effect where actually you can use statins for 3 years or so, and actually you still get the effect of those for a decade or so afterwards. Have I completely hallucinated that, or does that make sense?
Oh God, AI Mike is back. I don't know about that actually, but maybe that makes sense. We're talking about this kind of insidious cumulative effect of cholesterol deposits in your blood. So maybe there's something in that. I don't know. I'll just rattle through these last two because I think they're quick, and I don't want to put you on the spot anymore. I think you've passed the test, but a lot of people worry that statins cause dementia or memory loss, and there was something that the FDA published back in 2012 about a very small number of patients experiencing some short-term memory loss. But again, these were case studies. This wasn't really great evidence, and actually larger studies have found that there is no increased risk of cognitive decline with statins, and actually there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that they might be protective. And I guess that makes sense when I talked about those beautiful sunny corners of Devon that the brain still likes to visit. The last point is that, statins let you ignore diet and exercise. And obviously this is not true. And I think anyone with common sense would understand that by taking a statin, that doesn't exempt you from, living a healthy lifestyle and trying to eat well. So, closing thoughts, closing comments, Mike. How would you summarize what we've discussed? What are the key points?
So the massive learning points for me, or the things I take away from this at least, is really, I think, just to be a little bit more potentially proactive about this, but also just be a little bit more aware of it. And I know that's fresh in my mind because I've just checked my cholesterol levels and they weren't as perfect as I hope they might be. But what I keep coming back to is this cumulative damage over time, and actually that, putting in the effort to eat quite healthily, even if it is just a change in diet initially, but to eat healthily initially at an earlier age will actually really pay dividends longer term. And I think it's just moving away in our heads from that feeling of, oh, well, we'll just wait until we get to the 10% risk and then do something about it, which I think is key. Now, I've always been very pro statins, and they get a bad press a lot of the time. I think there are side effects, of course there are, but they're not probably as pronounced as a lot of people think. Given how prevalent cardiovascular disease is, this is so important, and actually getting it right and understanding it and being quite proactive is key here. What about you?
Yeah, I think my key take from this is that I am going to go and get my lipoprotein little a tested. I think being informed of that extra risk is valuable. I think if it empowers you to be more proactive and more conscious, knowing that you have a heightened risk, then if it's a simple test, I think that is worth doing. I'm also just going to briefly mention a bugbear of mine, and that is that when you walk down any high street, all you can buy is utter rubbish to eat. Like, these newsagents are full of brightly packaged, heavily processed, sugar-laden rubbish. And good food, fresh food is very expensive. I think we spend so much time and money and energy managing chronic disease. And I think if we just were, as a nation, a bit more collectively competent at addressing what food was available, for example, in certain areas, just, nationally, then it's certainly going to help the management of cholesterol long term. But I guess we're summarising here, and me going into a political rant on how the ruling party should govern what food is available in our schools and on our high streets is probably, we probably don't have time to cover that fully.
Yeah, you can pay extra for our Patreon to get Matt's political rants if you like.
Oh no, you can get that free. Just send me an email and we'll have a chat. But look, no, I've enjoyed this chat, and although this may be considered standard and boring, and it's cholesterol, surely everyone knows about it, I actually didn't know a lot of this until we've covered this in this episode, and I think it's critically important. It's the highest killer worldwide. We all need to manage this better and know about it, don't we?
Absolutely. Yeah, I enjoyed that. I'm going to go and work on my quiz for you in the next episode. In the meantime, thanks for listening. As always, give us a follow, write a nice comment, or a nasty comment is absolutely fine too. And we will hopefully see you all next week. Cheers, Matt.